I'm here with renowned, famous, hyper polyglot, Steve Kaufmann. I couldn't be more excited. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm fine. I don't know about hyper polyglot, but sometimes my wife thinks I'm hyper. She
Well, knowing
calls me
20 languages at B1 or B2 level at some point in the past, you've been at least that good, right? In each one of those languages is a
at times,
tremendous
yeah.
accomplishment. Yeah, and you spent
It's
decades
fun.
doing it.
It's fun. It's fun.
And what we're going to talk about today is a little bit, at least a little bit, that we go for in great depth about how you've learned languages, the techniques that you advocate, and about LingQ in particular, which you
Right.
founded.
Sure.
And also we'll continue a little bit of the conversation that we started on your channel. So everybody, if you
Okay.
haven't subscribed yet to Steve's channel, then you absolutely should, because the content there is amazing. And there is Latin on LingQ. So people
Yes.
can learn Latin with LingQ. And I want to know more
Absolutely.
about LingQ. So I know a little bit about LingQ, but I want you to tell my audience
All
a
right.
little bit, what on earth is LingQ, which is spelled
Well,
how?
LINGQ.
Yeah, there you
LINGQ.
go.
So, a lot of people say they want to learn languages. A smaller number are prepared to put the effort into learning languages. But when you say learning languages, people think they have to learn the grammar, learn the basics, master this, master that. And it has always been my experience that with enough exposure, the language is the teacher, that the brain will get used to the language with a little bit of an assist from a teacher, a little bit of an assist from a grammar resource that you might look at and then forget and look at again. But the fundamental thing is to do a lot of listening and reading. Let the language come into you and then gradually start using it. And as you start using it, you will stumble. But the better your comprehension, the better your vocabulary, the better you will do, the better you will understand the other person, the better you'll be able to have meaningful conversations, the better you'll be able to understand movies, films, books. And if you're able to do those things, then sort of like a snowball, you're able to consume more and more interesting, richer material that'll continue to help your language develop. So that's the basic theory. So LingQ basically is a website where we have a lot of always audio plus text, sometimes also video material in 42 languages. Beginner material with a lot of repetition, particularly high frequency verbs, which I think are very important to be able to say anything. You need verbs. But then within 3 to 6 months, you graduate from that into wanting to access everything that's out there on the web. And we live in an age where YouTube, Netflix, audiobooks, ebooks, there's just so much stuff out there, podcasts, TV programs. And all of these things can be brought into LingQ as lessons so that the basic learning functionality, which helps you learn words and phrases and keeps track of your activity level and encourages you to keep going so that your activity level, streak will continue and all this other stuff. And it tells you how many new words there are. This works both for content in our libraries and content that you might bring in from somewhere else. So it's a convenient, it's like Peloton or any of these other HIIT exercises that you can find on YouTube. It's if you're comfortable with a particular, place to work, place to work out, place to study languages, you may find LingQ attractive as a place that provides a lot of the resources and tools that you need to learn a language.
There you go. Well, that's a
Without
great
going
pitch.
into detail, because there's so much detail there. But essentially, that's the basic summary of it.
I just wanted to finish kind of saying about how
Sure.
you were asking me why bother, why learn them, and one of the most
Right.
compelling reasons I find is we get to interact with people who are able to speak one way to us from thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago in the exact same language, because it's a dead language, which means it doesn't change and evolve like modern languages, which means whereas Shakespeare is a little bit distant from us. But I speak Latin, and I speak Latin with other people, and the Latin that we speak is the same Latin, essentially, that Cicero spoke, that Ovid wrote in, that these authors, they all are basically using the same kind of idiom that we seek to
Right.
use. And what that gives us is the potential to directly access them, which is very interesting. It's what's happening now, and something we started talking about on your channel was that is there a movement, you asked me, of people trying to learn these ancient languages? And yes, and it is amazing. And it's there's a great author and teacher. His name is Christoph Rico, and he has done an incredible job of really revitalizing the spoken ancient Greek language at his institute, which is in Jerusalem, the Polis Institute. And he says that this is the sixth Renaissance. Of all the Renaissances that occurred, the first one starting the Carolingian Renaissance, which is in the 9th century, and then there's the Renaissance par excellence that we think of as the Renaissance. And these have all happened because of different technological things, which is usually what has caused it. And now the fact that, just at this point where we have incredibly dominant international languages, English, Spanish, Chinese, Russian, for example, French, which everybody's got to learn one of those just to kind of get by if they want to do anything that's outside of their kind of local area, right? We, of course, as native English speakers, have an unusual advantage, and maybe that's why we, as lovers of languages, you and I are maybe kind of looked at. Why does that guy know more than English? I don't know. That's the reaction I often have gotten myself. But yeah, thanks to the technology that we have, and thanks to things like LingQ, thanks to YouTube, we are able to
MP3 files, your name, and Google Translate, all this stuff.
It's and Google Translate for Latin just became less than terrible last year, which was amazing. Usually it's just shockingly bad. I actually did a couple videos last year where I reviewed Latin that was in some video game. It was clear it was just like put into Google Translate, and this nonsense came out, and it was hilarious. But
it has improved a lot. Google Translate in all languages has improved a lot.
It has. Yeah, that's that artificial intelligence algorithms is great. So, and thanks to that, thanks to the stuff that you have done with LingQ and all these other things that are happening at this time, people, if they're interested, if people were interested in Uzbek, how would they learn that 10 or 15 years ago? And I have a Polish friend who also likes to speak Latin, and he just dedicated his channel to learning that, and he's amazing at it. And why do that? Because it's cool. Because he wanted to. And now with these ancient languages, which otherwise, even though there have been speakers of ancient Greek and Latin for, especially for Latin for thousands of years, these communities, these people are usually rather isolated. But now we have the chance to speak across long distances and do all of these things. So whether when it comes to input methods, have you found that you really liked one, and then you really started going on to other, like the novelty of MP3s and audio became more accessible? Did you find that completely changed your methodology, or do you still like doing more old school kind of input-based reading, comprehensible input reading, or extensive reading?
Well, for me, the revolution began with, actually just before the MP3 revolution was the mini disc revolution. When I discovered that you could actually put a lot of audio content in a very small device. You could go out and interview people and generate some authentic conversation for someone, say, who's learning English. I was doing that. I was going around Vancouver talking to people in English, transcribing it, and making it available to immigrants and others who were learning English. And then it was MP3. Between that and the online dictionary, the idea that because the trouble, I like reading books, but if there's more than 5% unknown words per page, then reading books is tiresome, because if you look something up in a dictionary, no sooner do you close the dictionary than you've forgotten the meaning that you found there. So it's a very frustrating type of thing to do. At least that's been my experience. Whereas if I can read on an iPad or a computer and look up every word that I don't know, and then as in LingQ, where we have a method for saving, we differentiate the sort of highlighting and a whole bunch of stuff happening with these words that you've looked up. So it's not like you look it up and forget it, and then you got to look it up again and forget it. So these kinds of things moved me away. I still enjoy reading a paper book, and I still think that when you are able to read a paper book from cover to cover, 250 pages, whatever, that's a major milestone in your development in the language. And it is more pleasant. And it's easier to concentrate when you're reading a paper book. But you have to balance that against a high number of unknown words. And even if you say, well, I won't bother with that word, I still got 80% of the meaning, but in fact it's frustrating. So I end up wanting to know the meaning of that word, even if I forget it. So in terms of input method, for me it starts with listening, because it's the easiest thing to do. So in the morning, I have a little exercise routine that I do, and then I prepare breakfast and clean up after breakfast, and so all the while I'm listening. And while I'm listening, of course, there are things that I don't understand, and that motivates me then to want to read that on my iPad in LingQ, look up words, so that the next time I listen, I might have a slightly better chance of understanding what I'm listening to. So that's kind of the process. But when my language reaches a level, like if it were German or Spanish, obviously French is not a problem, even Japanese, Chinese, I can read it, in a paper book, and I'm fine. And even Russian, I think. But some of the other languages, I'm not there yet, so I prefer to read it in a situation where I can look words up. And I can access, like in Arabic, access the text-to-speech, because I'm sometimes guessing as to how that's pronounced.
Yeah, why can't they could just write vowels? They look so pretty,
Well, yeah, then their vowels is, I do it without the diacritics or whatever they're called, haraka, because you don't get that most of the time. So why train yourself to read Arabic with these little vowel symbols that aren't going to be available to you? So the other thing, by the way, on the subject of Greek, what I found very interesting in Greek is the number of ways you can pronounce or you can write the sound E. 3 or
very
4.
good, and that's right. There's 6 in modern
if you
Greek,
do dictation, we have dictation at LingQ, and it is impossible. I cannot guess until I know the word. Is that E I A I U? I can't even remember O I. Like everything is E. But then I say, well, what about the poor people who have to learn English? So English spelling is not very consistent either.
Yeah, it is comparably annoying, probably, with modern Greek and using the modern Greek pronunciation too for ancient Greek. There are people who advocate, just use the modern Greek pronunciation. That's fine if that's fine for you, but a lot is lost. A lot in the literature is simply completely inaccessible to a learner of ancient Greek if they're not using a pronunciation which conserves certain elements, like phonemic vowel length, which you probably even count in Japanese, for example, and pitch accent. Ancient Greek has both pitch accent instead of stress accent, and phonemic vowel length like Japanese. And we know, like, the difference between koko and koko se are completely different in Japanese. Here in the high school.
Well, even in English, you got hit and heat. Okay.
Yes.
To a lot of non-native speakers, it's the same sound, but of course, it's not the same sound.
You chose wisely instead of choosing the minimal pair with sheet. Very good. And what about interleaving, which I remember you talking with the context of being in a dictionary, not going back to the word again and again. And you were just saying that that's kind of a bad thing. Remember you talking about that kind of like being a good thing? Could you go more into that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, a lot of these things I had noticed myself, but then when you see that there's... research, neuroscientific research, which confirms that for the brain, this Manfred Spitzer, whom I quote a lot, a German neuroscientist, said, the brain needs repetition, but the brain also needs novelty. And if we keep feeding the brain the same stuff, the brain is learning less and less, and the brain is kind of turned off. And so trying to learn something is not a good idea. If you say you have to learn, a 3-page essay on, the Punic Wars, you can't read it 10 times. You're better off to read it once, read something else, read something unrelated, maybe read something that's somewhat related, and then come back to the same thing again. So to me, language learning is a bit like that. You want to sort of graze. Before I had LingQ, if I started a new language, I would buy 3 starter books. So that I'm, teach yourself, living language, whatever. And so I would cover more or less the same material, but using 3 different sources. So interleaving is this idea that the way our brains work, you can't just keep stuffing stuff into the brain. You've got to allow the brain to graze a little bit, go over somewhere else, and then come back again. And in that way, as you kind of relearn what you had in the meantime forgotten, you're actually going to learn it better. And there's, research that proves that this is the case.
That's interesting. And I was thinking too about how you mentioned that you start your day. I think this is actually key. You started with a physical exercise routine, right? Which I like to do as well. And the research. I mean, everybody out there who is been like, it's 1 month in, a New Year's resolutions, right? People are thinking about exercising. Now, there are all kinds of great reasons to exercise, but I think perhaps one of the best one of all, especially for those of us who are interested in learning languages, is the positive effect it has on the brain, on psychology, on feeling better. In the sense, physically, you'll feel better if you do some walking or jogging or swimming or any kind of thing. But as I understand it, the reason that one of the evolutionary scientists' hypotheses for why our brains are the size that they are is so that we have coordinated physical movement for doing complex tasks. Could be
Right.
whatever it is that our ancestors did that required that kind of complex physical task. So if we do some kind of physical task, it helps to at least allow our brains something they need, which then allows learning, especially something as challenging, potentially challenging as a language, to be that much easier. So I think that's really key. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Absolutely. I don't know what it does. It sends various chemicals charging around in your brain. But if I wake up sometimes not feeling that I slept all that well, I'll skip my exercise this morning. That's precisely the day when I need to do them. It's a 7-minute routine. I have it on my iPhone. I do my 7-minute routine, splash some water on my face, and I'm ready to go. So, but again, it's like, again, with languages, you got to develop habits. Language is about creating new language habits, but exercise is also about, having these exercise habits. And if you don't exercise, you don't feel good because you want to do it. It's a habit.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Well said. Well, who is this neuroscientist, the German neuroscientist you mentioned?
Manfred Spitzer.
When was he writing?
He's current. You can find him on YouTube, and he wrote a book called "Learning the Brain and the School of Life" or "Learning" or whatever. But it's full of gems. It's full of gems in there.
What others that you've found applicable?
Well, the sort of novelty. One of the things he says is, the brain cannot do otherwise than learn. The brain learns. If you feed experience, stimulus to the brain will learn. The brain will create its own patterns. So the brain is constantly learning. Of course, he confirms that we retain our plasticity into old age. We may learn a little more slowly. That's the sort of compensation for that is that we have so much more experience that helps our learning. I can't remember them all, quite honestly. I read a book, I forget much of it. So I constantly have to look back in there, but it's an interesting book.
Well, Steve, sort of citing your age because I looked it up on Wikipedia. As I recall, you learned most of the languages that you know. Like you're not 30, which is like I'm in my 30s, right? But the point, and that I want to make with that, what I wanted to I guess sort of also ask, how many languages did you learn after a certain age? Because haven't you learned most of them more recently?
More, yeah. So I would say that I basically went at Cantonese at the age of 55. Then came Korean. And then I dropped that in favor of Russian. And but I would say that if I can say that to varying degrees I speak or understand or have spoken 20 languages, even a bit of Turkish, that would make 21. I would say only 8 of those did I learn before the age of 55. And even there, I would say that my Italian has improved a lot since, even my Spanish. So I've improved. People say, well, if you learn another language, you'll forget a previously learned language. It might push it aside for a while, but when you go back to that language and spend some time with it, you end up actually better than you ever were. So learning more languages improves you, at least potentially, in all of your languages. I even saw something on the internet which says, you can never, if you speak more than one language, you actually lose ability in your native language. That's absolute nonsense. The more languages, the more ways of expressing things, different vocabulary, all of that helps you in your native language, helps you in languages that you speak well. Those, they won't slide. But languages that you don't speak that well, you might slide. But if you go back in there, you very quickly catch up and move ahead of where you were. So
and that's a phenomenon I've observed. And I wanted to know if you've seen research about it, because I know anecdotally for myself and from other people I've heard, having studied, I don't know, I've had times where I've studied, say, Spanish or French, and not touched it for years. Then I come back to it, and I find not only do I get back to that level where I was relatively quickly, but I find like I can do better. I remember the first time it happened is I was in Italy for the first semester. Then I came back to the U.S. because I had to, and I was going to do a second semester there. I wasn't speaking Italian for 3 months. I was studying Latin, actually. It was when I started learning Latin. But when I came back, my friend said, wow, you're speaking Italian so much better than you did. And they saw me like the day I left. And I'm like, how could that be possible? So I've heard this anecdotally. And has there been any kind of research into that? Or is it just an anecdotally thing that you confirm?
I certainly confirm it. I think, I don't know, see, I've sometimes called that the period of benign neglect, but I certainly noticed it. Like I remember once I was doing a lot of listening to Chinese stories. I can't remember what I was listening to. And then I had to go to Sweden on business, so I spent, a couple of weeks totally listening to my Swedish audiobooks, went to Sweden, spoke a lot of Swedish, came back home, and the Chinese was crystal clear. I understood the Chinese better. I've had similar experiences. I leave Persian for a while, I go and do some Arabic, I come back and chat with my tutor, and she says, wow, are you ever speaking better now? So we don't know what's going on, what goes on in the brain, but there is no danger in leaving a language for a while and coming back to it.
It's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of the interleaving technique, or that you talked about. You're in something and you come back to it. It gets it's really fascinating. It reminds me a little bit of muscle memory in the sense that if one lifts weights and doesn't gets to a certain kind of certain strength level, doesn't do anything for months, is weaker, but then after lifting the weights, after a day or two, or maybe a couple of weeks, they get right back where they were really quickly, which is interesting. And I wonder, I don't know, but even seems to me like it's even better, which I don't know how that happens, even better than muscle memory with physical muscle memory. Amazing.
Yeah, I don't lift weights, so I can't say, but I think if the ability to learn a language and the flexibility needed to go from one language to another, if that's a pure skill, then exercising that skill by learning yet another language can only make you stronger when it comes to any of the languages that you're speaking. But I'm not a neuroscientist, so that's just a anecdotal observation, personal.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, too, because there's so much that's come out research-wise in the past 50 years, I think, that's been really tangible, especially with the technological advancements we have with language and neuroscience to really understand what's going on, especially with comprehensible input methods to really, it's so interesting how, say, one of the sad but lovely things at the same time is the fact that per capita, Italians study Latin and ancient Greek more than anyone else, except maybe Greeks studying ancient Greek. Just an incredible, but they do it through, for the most part, the worst methods one could imagine to try to actually gain fluency in a language. They just do grammar translation, they translate it into Italian. Now, universally, that for a couple hundred years has been the way to learn Latin. You just translate into your language. And before, you used to translate into Latin, you used to speak Latin in class, but that kind of went away from the 1800s to the mid-20th century in a lot of places, especially why do you need to learn Latin? The utilitarian nature, especially after the World War, is just like, we need, the changing economy really had no need for Latin, so why would one even study it? All right, just learn to translate it so you can pick up some Caesar and you know what's going on, And the sad part there, I don't know if because you were saying before, you studied Latin in school, so you just learned to translate some declensions, or just some declensions and translations,
read some stuff, which was... So the problem is, we weren't very motivated at school, and I'm not sure that those students in Italy who study ancient Greek and Latin are tremendously motivated, since motivation is by far the most important element in language learning. It doesn't matter how many people you have in the school system who are forced to study Latin. If they're not motivated, they're not going to get very far.
I've always thought there are three components, the three essential elements to language learning, and one of them, mine, is also motivation. What are your other essential elements?
To me, I was once at a language conference in San Diego, and there was this lady who was the head of the language department at San Diego State or whatever university there, and she said, there's only three things that matter. The attitude of the learner, the time you spend with the language, and your ability to notice what's happening in the language. So that's one. The other one is Lom Kato, this Hungarian polyglot, who said the formula for language learning is sort of motivation plus time divided by all the negatives, frustration, intimidation, etc. So obviously the greater the motivation, the more time you spend, and the less resistance there is, fear, lack of confidence, blah, 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 that's going to determine how well you do. So they're kind of related. But I like this ability to notice. You have to notice things before you can start imitating them and start doing them. And a lot of people just don't notice. They don't notice the pronunciation. They don't notice that in Russian, the non-stressed O becomes A. You keep on reading O. The number of people who
That's my
speak
favorite
English.
part of Russian. How can you not notice that?
And, the people, at least now, and the people who read English, like non-native speakers, like, we had a Spanish girl working for us. So sword is sword. Yeah, there's a W there. Didn't notice the fact. Even if I say sword, she'll still say sword. Because people are influenced by their, the value of those letters in their own language.
Right.
And they don't notice what's going on. So I think it's important to make an effort to try to notice what's going on in the language.
Well, how can someone exercise that? Or is that just an innate ability and that can't be helped?
I think it's the willingness to... I've often talked about the importance of sort of what I would call cultural weightlessness. You have to get out of your own little sphere. I'm not an English Canadian learning French. I want to be French. So I want to imitate them. Because if we learn a language, we're actually imitating a portion of their culture. So I want to be Chinese. I want to be Japanese. Rather than staying within your little cocoon and within the sort of values of your own writing system, like the Japanese who use katakana pronunciation for pronouncing words in English and stuff. So I think it's a matter of attitude more than anything else. Like, I'll tell you, my father, who was born in what became Czechoslovakia, what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, in Canada there's a bank called the Bank of Nova Scotia. It's Nova Scotia. He would always say Nova Scotia. And there was an element there that it should be Nova Scotia. You know what I mean? Because in Czech it should be Scotia, should be sword.
Right.
Okay.
Sort of which is interesting because that would be a very highly conservative Latin pronunciation, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. That I've noticed that even in myself when approaching a language, wondering like, should I be? Because there's as a new learner, how do you know? Like this language could be that this thing that you're getting an input. Is this pronunciation of some undesirable or uncool or a not nice dialect that people are going to think is odd that I'm using, or for example, if someone ends up, for example, I love Canadian French, but it's not. It's like I knew lots of Japanese people when I lived in Tokyo who had learned in Australia, and they had the most bizarre accent to me, because I wasn't used to hearing a Japanese person with a strong Japanese accent using Australian phonology, and it was just like, whoa, it wasn't what I expected. I also still think it's weird for Europeans who have American accents in English, that is non-British or Irish speakers, native speakers of English, when they learn English to have an American accent, and to hear them do it so scarily well, use some kind of North American pronunciation, that it sounds like it's like weird. It's weird. I'm used to it now because I've had these friends for years, but I would just kind of expect, why wouldn't they learn British pronunciation? To me, that just kind of mentally makes sense. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, I think, like, for me, we're very flexible when we learn a foreign language. So if I spend a lot of time in Quebec, my pronunciation is going to be more Quebecois. If I spend a lot of time in Montpellier, my pronunciation is going to be more like le midi de la France. It's going to be influenced. Whereas in your own language, that doesn't happen. So you can have Scotsmen who've lived in the U.S. or Canada for 30 years, and they still have their Scottish accent. Learning Portuguese, for example, I want to listen to a lot of European Portuguese, a lot of Brazilian Portuguese. My Portuguese pronunciation is probably influenced by Spanish more than anything else because I can't seem to get away from that. And it doesn't matter. Like, I think your accent when you speak, it doesn't really matter. You have people who speak English, extremely well, who have pronounced accents, but who use the language very well, very elegantly, very precisely. And you have other people who, hi, how you doing, and slap you on the back and sound like they're American, but in fact they don't use the language well at all. So to me, accents are less important. I think if you live in a place, if you're in Australia for 10 years, you're learning Australian and you're Croatian or something, you're going to end up speaking like Australians. And that's the most useful accent for you to have. By the way, I very much rely on listening and even text-to-speech. And I'm not a big fan of the IPA for that reason, because the International Phonetic Alphabet is going to say, based on some arbitrary form of the language, this is how that sound is pronounced. But in fact, there might be significant regional variation within that language. So it's misleading to rely on the International Phonetic Alphabet. You're far better off to listen, maybe hear a variety of accents, then find out which accent you find the most appealing or the most useful, and then concentrate on trying to imitate that based on what you hear. But again, trying to notice just exactly how they pronounce it based on what you hear, rather than trying to decipher the sounds based on the IPA. But a lot of people swear by the International Phonetic Alphabet. I've never used it. Never even learned it.
Well, the internet. I mean, yeah, you see it in a lot, and I like IPA, but you have to know it to a really fine level just to even have a conversation with someone. If you want to, like, it's a kind of language or linguaggio in of itself.
Right.
This because like you might see English transcribed in IPA with the regular looking R, which is the trilled R sound, and if they're using a North American pronunciation of English, where that simply doesn't occur, so it's technically but it's just a simplified version. That's a broad transcription, not a narrow transcription. Right. So it's fine. Right. It's just sort of like, because I don't want to find the darn thing which looks like the R that is the actual R sound of English, because just typing a regular R is more convenient. It's that kind of an issue too. So one has to really like kind of know that subtlety in IPA for sure. I agree. Yeah.
The only IPA like is the one I drink.
Cheers. This is water, anyway. But cheers anyway.
Yeah.
What else I wanted to ask you about? So, learning. Oh, yeah, two things. One about pronunciation, because I wanted to go with that. I'm fascinated by ancient pronunciations, reconstructing them in different centuries for both Greek and Latin. And I've focused on a couple that I use about like 1st century AD for both those languages, just to kind of, because I have like my own head canon of like these pronunciations could coexist, and that helps me. But that's just my own subjective preference. It doesn't really matter. One could use ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin and then a reconstructed Attic pronunciation. It doesn't matter. And these pronunciations, just like you were saying, much like the varieties of French, the varieties of Spanish, the varieties of English, one can communicate in them. So, for example, people might want, if they're learning Latin, like a lot of my followers on this channel are interested in doing, that might only want classical pronunciation. So they hear ecclesiastical and they're like, no, thank you. And I want to emphasize strongly, because I like both pronunciations fine. I happen to use classical more, but I can speak in ecclesiastical without too much difficulty, is at least to expose yourself to both pronunciations, just as we all should get the chance to expose ourselves if we're learning Spanish to both the Spanish varieties in the Americas as well as European Spanish or Portuguese. These varieties, because if you say, I'm not going to use that source, you want to tie another hand behind your back? This is not an easy game. And with Latin, we don't have native speakers anyway. We have some really fluent speakers out there, which are great to listen to. And some of them use ecclesiastical pronunciation. Some of them use classical pronunciation. Some of them use one or the other, and they have really strong accents, which probably wouldn't be at all right for some kind of ancient or proper ecclesiastical Latin or whatever. But I would just say you have to be open to all of it, because otherwise, for example, the content on LingQ has all kinds of variety for Latin. And you can concentrate on pronunciation. Don't worry. Those kinds of things can be, if you really want to do a specific kind of pronunciation, whatever it is, get used to listening to all different kinds, and then you can focus in on and use whatever one you want in the end.
Yeah, I totally agree. And of course, people ask us to label. So we tag, say, European Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, whatever it might be. But my feeling is it's really unnecessary. First of all, everything we have where there's audio, there's a text. And the best way to learn vocabulary is through reading. So it's the same language. Like between Portuguese and in Brazil and Portugal is 7% the same. It's the same words. So you're going to acquire that vocabulary. If there's something very interesting in a variety of Portuguese that you've decided you're not going to use, then you're missing out. So I think and the other thing is, a lot of the people who are insistent, like I only want to hear, Mexican Spanish or Brazilian Portuguese, most of those people cannot yet tell the difference. So at an early stage in the language, you can't hear the difference. You don't know what it is. And by the time you can tell the difference, then you can comfortably use different sources as input material and then focus in on that form of the language that you want to imitate as your output, accent. But people make too much of a deal about accent differentials. It's all about learning words. And certainly at the early stages, you're not going to damage yourself by listening to a form of the language that you're not interested in speaking in the long run. You're adding vocabulary, you're adding comprehension, and when the time comes, you'll focus in on the accent that's most valuable to you.
Exactly. Very well said. To finish up, because there's a lot of languages that I've talked about on this channel. I know a lot of people here are interested in learning any number of languages. Mm-hmm. Can you let's just distill your entire life experience into a soundbite? I'm just kidding. How someone wants to learn a language of their choice, feel free to choose any language that comes to you. If you want to use a specific example, how do they learn language X?
There are two stages. The beginning stage with lots of repetition. I can listen to things 30, 40 times, not at one sitting. I'll go lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, back to 1. So lots and lots of repetition to get a toehold in the language. And then very quickly you'll run out of high frequency words. So you are now in for a long haul. So make sure you find things interesting to you, content of interest, content that's compelling, and stay with it for the enjoyment of consuming that content in the language, and very gradually, you will improve.
Excellent. And use LingQ. And
of course.
Well, recently and I was saying too, someone who's doing so much great contribution to Latin on LingQ is Carla Hurt, and I just want to give her a shout out to thank her, because she's been putting out so much out there, which is helping beginners and intermediate level learn more of the language, thanks to your website.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I should meet her one day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Steve, I enjoyed this so much. I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. We're just scratching the surface here.
We are. That's
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye, Luke.